Hello, everybody. Joey Sparks here, and God's mercies, they're new again this morning.
This morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. I woke up this morning with my mind.
Acts chapter 4, you see the early church multiplying in number, and then you see the first response by the enemy, the spiritual enemy, through the Jewish enemies, is an attempt at persecution. But by the time that chapter ends, you see the church emboldened to preach even more. And some have said that at the end of that chapter, it's like the Jews thought they're throwing water on a fire to extinguish it, but they didn't know it was a grease fire. So when they threw water on it, they spread it. You ever made that mistake, throwing water on a grease fire? Persecution to true faith, true Christianity, is like throwing water on a grease fire. It causes it to spread, not to extinguish. Well, you see exactly how that happens when you look at Paul's words in Philippians 1. Listen to verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Paul gives two reasons. He says, listen, I know it would seem like me being imprisoned would limit the gospel. This imprisonment is the one that's recorded in Acts 28, and that book closes by saying the gospel was proclaimed. He proclaimed the gospel without hindrance. But he says this imprisonment has actually served to advance the gospel even further, because I'm able to teach the gospel to people I ordinarily would not have been able to teach, those in the imperial guard. But then he says, but it's also emboldened even more of you to preach the word without fear. So because they see Paul being taken care of, and they see Paul suffering for the gospel, they are more resolved themselves to preach without fear. So think about that for a moment. Paul has this ability to see persecution not as what it would seem, but as more than it would seem. Everything is not always as it appears, and Paul proves that. But then look at verse 18, how he continues this theme. Everything is not always as it seems. He says there are some people who are kind of trying to take advantage of the gospel by preaching it for impure motives, for making money, for gaining social status or something like that. He says in verse 18 that even if those preach the gospel for false motives, what then? Only that in every way, whether pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So whether they're doing it for false motives or for true motives, the gospel's out there, the gospel's out there. And I can rejoice in that. Think about that for a moment. You have people who are sometimes even against Paul and Paul's personalities and Paul's sufferings, and he says, yet they're teaching the gospel, even if their motives are wrong, even if they're selfish. If they're teaching the gospel's the gospel. That's Paul showing us that everything is not as it appears in this world. There are greater truths that sustain us. The gospel does the work. Does the work even when he's in prison. Does the work even when those are doing so for false motives. And we thank you for your time this morning. It's our prayer. God's timeless word will be on your mind all day today.
I woke up this morning.